Hello, everyone. Nice to see and meet you all. My name is Tyler, and I, like you, am an engineer. I'm a mechanical engineer. Thank you for that introduction. And I work for Catapult Design. I was a little inspired by Halloween here with my color choices, although our color is orange, so it seemed appropriate. Anyway, like I said, I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm the co-founder, or one of the co-founders and the chief operations officer for Catapult Design. And Catapult, for those of you, thank you, who aren't familiar with it, is a nonprofit design firm dedicated to creating life-enhancing products for low-income consumers around the world. And we've worked with a whole wide range of organizations, from really big development organizations like the World Bank to really small startup social ventures and social enterprises, kind of the whole gamut. And we've also worked on a whole wide range of technologies as well. For example, water transportation with this organization Wello in India, looking at coming up with a design solution for mostly women and children who are having to carry water to a well or a river and back home multiple times a day. We've also worked on solar home systems with, in this example, Simpa Networks in India, as well as a similar organization called 1 Degree Solar in East Africa, but trying to think about how we can make solar home systems and electricity and lighting accessible for people who don't have access to electricity currently. We've also looked at developing food products, specifically a fortified food product for infants that are transitioning from breastfeeding to solid foods, and creating a branded product for this organization, Living Goods. We've also worked on improved cook stoves. In this example, EcoZoom, but trying to come up with improved cooking devices that have received a lot of attention and success in laboratory settings, but trying to actually bring them into the kitchens of cooks around the world. And in addition to these examples, we've worked on agricultural processing products, medical devices, sanitation products. So a pretty wide range of products. And the kind of the unifying thing here is trying to use engineering and design skills that would normally be used in industry in America, but bringing that to bear for low income and underserved populations around the world. And we, the team at Catapult, got our start with Engineers Without Borders, as was said in my introduction. And the reason we were all interested is because, like you, we had technical skills. We really liked solving problems. We liked sinking our teeth into them. And at the same time, we wanted to try and figure out, kind of like Jim was talking about in his talk, how can we change the world? As engineers, how can we bring our problem-solving acumen to bear? And so that led us to start Catapult. And Catapult occupies a really interesting intersection of things. The intersection of technical skills, of design, and humanitarianism. And as the chief operations officer at Catapult for the last 5 years, I've had a really unique opportunity to develop my own perspectives about this particular intersection of activity. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of that with you today. And the first thing that I noticed is when I looked at the title of this conference, the Global Humanitarian Technical Conference. And when I was looking at that, I realized that I'd be speaking with a bunch of fellow engineers, but that what was really interesting was, based on our years of experience in the field, the issue and the challenge wasn't nearly so much technical as it was human. Specifically, human behavior change with regard to adopting and effectively using new technology. And that distinction is really important, and it's really going to form the basis of the rest of my talk this evening. What comes next? Right, okay. So from our perspective, technology is the easy part. We're all engineers with a lot of technical capability. You know, we can land things on the moon and create incredible interconnected global networks. But the challenge that we run into again and again isn't the technical side of things. It's the human-technical interface and human behavior, and looking at how we address that. And the hard part is really taking that technology and turning it into products that are used effectively by large numbers of people. And those are kind of really important items. effectively by large numbers of people, because you can get a few people to use something, or you can get a lot of people to use something not very well, but how do you get a large number of people to use something effectively? So what I want to do is I want to look at this challenge a little bit, this human behavior challenge, through the lens of 4 examples of really common interventions, technical interventions, that I've seen around the world in the last 5 years. So one example is hand washing. And maybe that doesn't seem like such an incredible technical solution, but the development of soap and hand washing is a technical solution to the problem of germs. And for all of us who are accustomed to washing our hands before we eat, after we use the toilet, it makes sense. We understand microbes and germs and the whole disease transmission scenario. However, for communities that don't have a grasp of germs, who don't have a grasp of bacteria, the whole introduction of a very simple solution like a hand washing station that's intended to encourage them to wash their hands doesn't have a lot of meaning. It doesn't really fit into their view of the world. And that's one major aspect of a successful product or technology that I want to talk about today, and that's that it has to be meaningful. The product has to fit into the lives of the people who will use it and help them meet a real need that they currently have in a significant way. And if a product isn't successful, the likelihood of it actually making a difference isn't so great. So another common intervention that I've seen, and this is kind of I think a poster child of development gone wrong, is the donated farm equipment scenario. And the way that it usually transpires is you have some extremely well-meaning group in the United States that decides that they want to help farmers in Tanzania by collecting some money, purchasing a tractor, and getting a tractor sent over there, and maybe sending someone with some skills and the ability to teach them how to use the tractor over there, and introducing a tractor. And the farmers, they receive the tractor, they use it for a season or two, and then something like the fuel pump breaks. And then it's like, great, there isn't another fuel pump for this particular tractor for like 5,000 miles. And it's like, okay, that's a problem. And maybe they could communicate with the group back home or back where the tractor came from and get another fuel pump. But at the end of the day, this isn't a really sustainable approach, because the tractor, as it were, isn't really accessible for the people there. And when I say accessible, it means that the intended end users understand it, both its intention and how to use it, and they're able to afford and purchase them locally, and they're able to use them easily, and when they break, they can fix them. So if it's not accessible, it's not a solution that's going to catch on at scale. It's not going to be able to have a huge impact because it isn't accessible to the people who need to use it. Another attribute, as I see it, of products that are likely to succeed. Another example, and Jim mentioned this as well, is chlorine and chlorinated water. And that's a solution that we're all extremely familiar with here in the United States. Much of our water is chlorinated. But it's really struggled to catch on and be popular in the developing world, despite a lot of attempts at introducing it. And I've seen people trying to introduce it at point of access, like community wells and community pumps. I've also seen people try and introduce it in home systems. Like this bottle here is a bottle of Suro in Rwanda. It's a chlorinated solution that people are expected to put into their drinking water. The issue is that the people don't like the way it tastes. And that's a major issue because they don't want to use it. They don't like it, they don't find it palatable, and so they don't desire it. It's not a desirable solution given their preferences and their experiences. They would rather boil the water, or if they think it's clean, just drink it, as opposed to chlorinating it. So the issue here is that the product isn't desirable. But if it's going to be effective, it has to. The product has to appeal to the intended end users, and they have to be willing to go out of their way and to make sacrifices to get it or to use it. Another important aspect of products that are really effective at the end of the day. And then the last example I want to talk about are improved cook stoves. I mentioned those earlier. And there's been an incredible amount of technical work that's gone into cook stoves. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but there's a lot of technical research that's gone into it, and some really impressive science at reducing the amount of fuel required, reducing emissions, etc. The problem is that over and over again, I've seen improved cook stoves sitting abandoned in a corner or turned into a stool to sit on, or hacked by this was hacked by an end user. There used to be a plancha on top and they call it a rocket stove elbow built into it. And the users just kind of hacked it up to try and make it work because it wasn't working the way they wanted it to work. And it was either it wasn't getting hot enough, or they couldn't boil things the way they wanted to, or it required too constant tending. Maybe they didn't get enough light out of it at night, or a lot of them don't work with traditional cookware or traditional dishes. So any way you look at it, the problem here is that it wasn't working the way they needed it to. And while it may have worked well in the lab, it didn't work well in the field, which means ultimately it wasn't effective. And that's the fourth aspect of really successful products, as I've seen them, is that they have to be effective. They have to do what they were intended to do. If it's going to have an impact, if it's going to be used by large numbers of people, and if it's going to make a difference. And these 4 attributes make a really handy acronym that I created, which is basically MADE. Is that products have to be made. They have to be meaningful, they have to be accessible, they have to be desirable, and they have to be effective. And really what all this means is that people have to understand it. They have to be able to purchase and use it, they have to want it, and they have to benefit from integrating it into their lives. And if our creations aren't made, if they're not meaningful, accessible, desirable, and effective, they won't be used in significant numbers, and they won't make any difference to the end users they were intended to help, which means it was all just an exercise without really accomplishing anything. And I know that all of you who are presenting papers and really invested in all of your research and all of your work that brings you here to this conference today, we want our work to make a difference. And we don't want it to just be an exercise, which means we need to be thinking about this, and we need to be thinking about it the entire way through, from when we start to when we're actually trying to get it from a lab and into the field. So all of that said, how do we go about giving our creations the best possible chance of being made? Well, like I said, I have experience in these 3 realms, and I think that we engineers have a lot to learn from the design profession. And because the word's a bit overused and a bit general, what do I mean when I say design? It's like Jim was talking about the D School at Stanford, but a lot of people think it's graphic design. Those who are unfamiliar with the field, it's not graphic design. It's also not fashion design. I get that sometimes. It's like, no, I'm not designing skirts and dresses. And I'm also not talking about putting a fancy wrapper on things that engineers make, because designers are sometimes associated with giving things a form or giving them a look or a feel that's irrespective of the actual function of the device, and that's not what I'm talking about either. What I am talking about is human-centered design, and I cribbed this directly from IDEO's Human-Centered Design Toolkit, and IDEO is one of the major leaders in the design field and helped coin the phrase, but I think this sums it up really well, which is human-centered design is a process that helps people hear the needs of the people and communities they're designing for, create innovative approaches to meet these needs, and deliver solutions that work in specific cultural and economic contexts. And the reason I want to highlight this is I think this is the way that we can go about making sure that everything we're working on ends up being meaningful, accessible, desirable, and effective. And so that's all well and good, but how do we do it? Well, designers have a whole suite of tools and methods that they've put together to help them understand the lives and realities of the people they're designing for. Many of them taken from anthropology and ethnography. And here's a short list. There's actually a lot more than this. User interviews, user observation and task shadowing, home visits and home stays, home and community and market audits, videography, games and puzzles, role-playing, and participatory design. And I could go on, but I don't have time to get into them today. However, if any of you have any interest in this or would like to know more, I can point you to some resources, and my email will be up at the end of this, and you can drop me a line, and I'm happy to point you in the right direction. So the trick here is human-centered design can help us figure out how to get our solutions made. And that's really important. So let's think about how exactly is human-centered design going to help us make products that are meaningful, accessible, desirable, and effective. Because it's one thing to talk about it, but how does it actually work? So we have this again. Meaningful. How can human-centered design help us ensure that our products and solutions are meaningful? Well, if we can relate to our end users' perspectives, we can begin to grasp what's important to them as opposed to ourselves, and to understand what their values are, and how to see what we're offering may or may not have meaning in their lives. And if the solutions we're offering are irrelevant to them, then they're not going anywhere. And that's really the trick, is that meaning aspect of things, is connecting with their lives can help us understand what's meaningful to them so that we can make sure that our solutions and what we're offering is also meaningful. So how can How can human-centered design help us ensure that our products and solutions are accessible? Well, when we relate closely with people, we can begin to understand the constraints that they're living with, what they can afford, what tools they're familiar working with, what resources they do or do not have at their disposal, what cultural limitations they may be working with. We understand the confines of their reality and what can work within that. And that can help us think about ways of making our solutions accessible as well. So it can also help us make sure that our solutions are desirable. And this is really important as well, because desires are what motivate us. They're what lead us into our actions and our choices. And if we can understand what people desire, what motivates them, then we're able to think about the solutions that we'll be able to offer and how that will fit with their desires. So human-centered design and connecting with our end users can help there as well. And then effective. I think as engineers, this is probably where we have the least amount of trouble, in the sense that we're working on technical solutions. And if we're trying to bring them to the market, they tend to work. But at the end of the day, it's really important that we have that as well. And understanding what effective means to people can help us make sure that they understand the effectiveness of it as well. So now that we have a bit of an understanding of what human-centered design is connecting with our users and understanding them, and if we can see the way they can help our products get made meaningful, accessible, desirable, and effective, let's look at it in action so I can get into a little bit of how this actually works. So an example I want to talk about is the treadle pump. So this came from an organization that's a huge role model for Catapult. It's called Kickstart. And they work in East Africa, and what they did is they took a really successful technical solution that came out of IDE in Myanmar. It's this treadle pump you can see here. And it's a really simple technical solution. You stand on it, you walk on it like a stair stepper, it pumps water, pulling it out of a canal or a well and distributing it among a bunch of crops, helping farmers increase their yields, increase their income, lift themselves out of poverty. And like I said, it was really successful in Myanmar. Thousands of families had made a real difference in their lives using these pumps. So Kickstart thought, hey, we can bring these pumps from Myanmar and introduce them in Kenya. And when they did, surprisingly, no one bought it. It went nowhere. It was a flop. And they didn't really understand why. So taking a page from human-centered design, they started talking to their end users. They started asking, why aren't you using it? And they talked to people who were and who were not. What they found is that women didn't feel comfortable using the pump. And the reason women didn't feel comfortable using the pump was because when they were using it, they had to raise their leg higher than was considered modest in the skirts that they were wearing. So what we had here was a technical solution that worked, right? We had a pump, there was nothing wrong with the pump technically. But from a user's perspective, it didn't work and didn't integrate into their lives effectively. So that was a problem. But it was only when they actually went out and bothered to relate to their end users and really understand their lives and their preferences that they were able to divine and to kind of discover what it was that was holding it back. So they went back to the drawing board. They redesigned it so you didn't have to raise your foot as high. And when they reintroduced the super money maker pump in Kenya, it took off. It's been extremely successful. And again, thousands of families in Kenya have managed to increase their farm productivity and lift themselves out of poverty using this pump. And it was only by virtue of speaking with end users that they overcame a human behavior issue, not a technical challenge that had limited the efficacy of the pump. So it's really important, again, for us to be thinking about how do we connect with our end users and how do we find out what their perspective is. Another example is the life straw. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the life straw, but when it was introduced a few years ago, it was on the cover of a bunch of magazines, and like the Cooper Hewitt's Design for the Other 90% exhibit, and everybody thought it was really cool until you actually look at how it works. And I don't know how many of you can really relate with this, but if you're really thirsty and you want a satisfying drink of water, I don't think bending over and stuffing your face into a mud puddle is really the way to do it. And unsurprisingly, that's the way that most of the users that were expected to use the device felt. But to the credit of LifeStraw, they went and talked to their users, and they said, well, what's going on? Why aren't people liking it? And what they found is that beyond the kind of user experience issues, there were also a lot of behavioral issues that it just simply wasn't attending to. A lot of the families preferred to drink their water with their meals in the morning and the evening, and they drank as a family. And as opposed to standing around a bucket and passing the straw from family member to family member, they would prefer something where they could all drink together. So they went back to the drawing board, and they came up with the LifeStraw Family 2.0, which has actually been really successful. Like it's received a lot of positive comments from end users, and the reason is you have a reservoir at the top where you can pour a significant amount of water that drains through a filter, collects at the bottom, and then you can pull off as much as you need and drink then. So it fit into the general water consumption habits of the people, where they could load it up at night, it would filter through the evening, and in the morning they'd have water for their meal, repeat the process again for water that evening. So it worked much better into the daily habits and rituals of the people. But again, the original LifeStraw, it worked. I'm sure it met all of the technical specifications that they had set out for it. The issue was that it just wasn't that nice to use, and it didn't really work for people. And the way they discovered that was by talking to the people and really connecting with and understanding the needs and preferences and behaviors of the end users that were expected to use the product. And as a result, that's how this has become a significant success. We're aware of an organization that's distributing 600,000 of them in Rwanda. So considerable scale, but only by virtue of really talking to the end users. So what does all of this mean to us as engineers? How can we begin to learn from designers and make our solutions more human-centered? And I have 3 suggestions as to how we can approach that. First, we need to decide that this is important. We need to decide that connecting with our end users and putting them at the center of our activity is something that we want to do, and that it's something that is important to us. And we have to acknowledge that our thinking must extend beyond the simply technical. And I know that's our comfort zone is the technical, and it's what we get excited by, but we have to look outside of that if we're really going to be making a difference with our work. And we have to realize that we're not designing just for ourselves. And that's a critical design error, is to design something for yourself if you're expecting other people to use it. And we have to emphasize the human aspect of our work. And that can be a considerable shift away from traditional engineering thinking. Because I remember when I was going through the engineering curriculum, we certainly didn't talk about users and clients all that much. And when it was mentioned, most of my fellow students were like, what? We don't want to take their input. They don't know what they're talking about. They're non-technical and capricious, and they have all their preferences that are unreasonable. We know what's up, and we'll take care of it. Well, that is flying in the face of the goal of being more human-centered. And I know that as engineers, we all have really serious opinions and experience about how things should be done and how they can be done well and how to best tackle really tricky technical issues. And I think that gets us through a lot of challenges. But at the same time, it can also be a trait that leads to one of our major failings. And that's what I call the myth that engineer knows best, which I'm sure some of you have encountered. And I believe that this is the single most pressing obstacle that engineers face to creating effective tools that address global social inequality. And why is that? It's because it closes our ears, it closes our eyes, and it closes our minds and our hearts to other people's perspectives because we're so attached to our own. And if we're going to provide effective solutions for people whose realities are wildly different than our own, the only way to do that is to accept the fact that we don't know what the answer is, but that we're willing to show up and listen and to look, and we're willing to relate and to experiment and to fail and to try again, and ultimately to succeed, and that we're willing to do that in partnership with the people that our creations are intended to serve. And that's really the only way that transformative products get made. And third and last is empathize. Regrettably, engineers are not really seen as paragons of empathy and personal connection, or as even having great interpersonal skills. I think that does engineers a disservice. Of course we're capable of empathy, we're all human beings. The issue is that we're not typically asked to use our human empathy in our work. We're expected to show up and do our calculations, do our analyses, turn out drawings, but we're not really expected to connect with people and to try and understand what's driving them. That's somebody else's job. But it has to be our job as well if we're really going to be turning technical solutions into problems that can address people's needs. So continuing with that approach of letting that someone else's job is just going to continue with the problem and develop solutions that don't get made. What we need to do is get out of our technical heads and get into our feeling hearts to relate with people as people so that we can better serve them and so we can better integrate their reality into what we're creating from the very beginning. And ultimately, we as engineers, we can accomplish amazing feats. There's no doubt about that. But simply accomplishing really incredible technical things isn't enough. What we have to do is ensure that our work is human-centered and that we connect with the people we're designing for. Because if we don't, our products won't be used by large numbers of people. They won't be used in effective ways. It won't make a difference, and it will all have just been an exercise. So I encourage all of you, if we're talking about all of our papers and everything in the course of this conference, to really think about how does this serve the people I'm trying to serve, and how can I integrate their reality into my thinking from the absolute root level. Thank you very much.